Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking Comanche history. We're exploring a lot of interesting things to me, especially since I'm a guy that lives in Comanche, has been born and raised here. There's so much kind of rich history within our town and even the state of Texas and also within the people. Now, Jay is not a guy, by the way, Jay Firsching, welcome to the show. Thank you. Did I pronounce your name right?
You did. Firsching. Yep.
Okay, okay, Firsching. Jay works with a company called Architects, and as a part of this exploration of the history of Comanche, and thanks to Southwestern Group for investing in Comanche and giving us an opportunity to tell these stories, Jay is kind enough to join the show, talk about what he does, and how that is going to help us shine a light on the history of Comanche and maybe fund some projects. So, Jay, if you don't mind, real quickly, just maybe a minute or two, tell everybody who you are and how you come to be on this podcast at this moment.
Well, again, as you've said, my name is Jay Firsching. I work for Architects. I've been with Architects for about 24 years now. We're based in Dallas. We have offices in Austin and San Antonio as well. I have been doing this, started out at the Texas Historical Commission back in the late 90s, studying courthouses, and gradually moved into working in Dallas and doing a variety of all kinds of different projects. But what brought me to Comanche was my relationship with Cole and Southwest Properties. He was involved in the rehabilitation of a really important building in downtown Amarillo. It was an old office building we turned into a hotel called the Barfield. And that's how we established a relationship. And he later told me that he had some properties in Comanche that he was looking at. And we leveraged financial incentives based on historic preservation for his project in Amarillo. And he was interested in seeing if that could happen in Comanche. So he brought me on board to start laying the groundwork for that.
Great. Well, thanks for that little introduction. What is it about your job that, I'm curious or I'm interested. I think our listeners will be interested in, where do you get the motivation to, go dig up these old buildings? I say dig them up, but to kind of facilitate the preservation of them. Are you just into that kind of thing, or are you from a small town that you thought, or a big town even, or just what got you into this kind of work?
It was really a circuitous route that brought me to this. I went to college at Texas A&M and studied communications there. Graduated in the 80s, back when the economy at the time was terrible. And eventually was encouraged to go back to school and study something else that I was interested in, which was buildings, history, construction. I always kind of dabbled in construction, worked my way through college doing construction work. And so I applied to the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Texas, their graduate program there, and got in and started over. Studied historic preservation, found it really fascinating, and I was exceptionally lucky in that the Historical Commission started a program focusing on county courthouses right about the time I was finishing school. And they hired me immediately. I had a job right away and spent the next few years traveling around Texas studying courthouses. And I just, I love old buildings. I love history. And it's just been a perfect fit for me.
Awesome. When you say studying old courthouses, what goes into that? What is the study of old courthouses?
Well, I mean, this is the kind of thing, you got a lot of rabbit holes with historic preservation stories, but back in 1993, the Hill County Courthouse burned down on New Year's Day. At the time, it was pretty clear that county courthouses around the state were in a state of disrepair. Lack of investment, changes in technology, all kinds of things that really put them in a bad state. I mean, the the courthouse in Comanche is still a good example of a courthouse that's in need of a lot of updating and changes. But what the Historical Commission did is they got a grant for me and a couple of my colleagues at the time to go to a sampling of counties all around Texas and crawl all over their buildings and find all the problems we could find, because they didn't want to have any more fires and any more courthouses to burn down. So, doing that involved a couple of things, like all these projects do. First is going back and researching the history of the buildings, who built them, when, how, they were built, what's important about them, and about their history over time, because that helps inform exactly how you want to treat a building. You want to preserve important aspects of a building's history. So to know what those aspects are, you got to do some research. But then it also involves crawling around them and finding all the problems and writing reports about what needs to be done to get them back in shape. A lot of people think of my kind of work as taking old buildings and making them like they were when they were built, which is true to a certain extent. But really the goal is to take a building and preserve everything that's cool about its history, but put all kinds of new stuff in it so it operates like a modern building. So that's kind of what we do. We study them, figure out how to make that happen, and make recommendations. So we did that study. We studied about 50 buildings as part of that study. At the same time I was doing that, my company, where I am now, Architects, was reconstructing that courthouse in Hill County that burned down. And just by really sheer chance, we wound up coming together, and they hired me from the Historical Commission to come and work for them and help them work on courthouses. And so since that time, I've done that, but I've expanded into working on all kinds of historic resources.
Yeah. Well, now that's an interesting string for me. I think it'll be an interesting string for the listeners. How that is relevant then to business owners in Comanche who may have historical buildings. Is there a blueprint, let's say, for understanding preservation of a historical building, if that is of interest to you, and how you might find financial help or grants, or I don't even know. I'm making some of this up because I don't know, and that's why it's good to have you here and tell us about it. Mm-hmm. Is there kind of a blueprint around that? I mean, it makes sense to me that the courthouses need to be upgraded, kept in operation, all those things, especially I think Comanche recently actually has got some money or made the decision to upgrade their courthouse. So that will be good. We'll see that begin, I think, in the next couple of years. So here we are chasing the lots of rabbits. I'm going to stay with the first rabbit. What's the blueprint for getting something like that accomplished? Is there one?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind when it comes to things like you're talking about, what funding sources, grants, and that kind of thing, there's not a lot of private investment in giving or nonprofit investment in giving grants to people to fix up old buildings. There's just not. So when you're talking about where that funding might come from and where help might come from, you're usually talking about the government. And people are skeptical of the government. They don't want the government in their business much of the time. And so if you take courthouses as an example, the construction, preservation, maintenance of courthouses are a government issue. County governments are subsets of state government, and it's the county and state government's responsibility to take care of those buildings. So when we finished our study with the courthouse program, identifying what the problems were statewide with courthouses, then Governor George W. Bush worked with us to set up a grant program to put state funding into helping counties fix their buildings up. And a lot of counties jumped right on that, but a lot of other ones were kind of skeptical, because even though they're themselves government entities, they don't want the state government coming in and meddling in local affairs. So it's been a long process over a period of time, bringing counties in. It's been a very successful program. They've done dozens and dozens of buildings. they started with the oldest ones first, really. And now some of the ones that are a little newer, like the one in Comanche that was finished in the 40s, are eligible, and they're applying, and they're getting money to do some of the work that needs to be done.
When
So,
you just said eligible, what makes them eligible?
well, in historic preservation, the first thing you look at with a historic building is almost always, is it at least 50 years old? There are exceptions to that, like if the really important event happened somewhere, or a really important building is built and it's younger than 50, sometimes they'll consider that historic. But for the most part, rule of thumb, 50 years old. So, um, when we started the courthouse program, we started with buildings that were generally built in the 1880s, because that's
Yeah.
when we had a boom in courthouse construction in Texas. So, uh, first thing is age. And once you have that, the building needs to be, it needs to resemble what it was, preferably when it was built. Sometimes if it's, there's buildings that will be changed so drastically over time that they don't represent the historic building anymore. So sometimes those are disregarded. But for the most part, 50 years old. And then with the state program, there's strings. There's always strings. So, the county, every county participating in that program has to do a really in-depth study of their building, bring in somebody like me to crawl all over it, write a big long report about everything they need to do, and come up with a budget, an estimated budget, what it's going to cost. And Comanche did that. They hired a company to come in and do that, and have been working through the process. And they just got a grant to do the architectural drawings, specifications for restoring the courthouse. That is, fixing up everything that makes it cool, and then putting all that new technology in it to make it function like a modern courthouse.
Yeah. Well, that's. I was interested. I was just curious. Like, okay, so it needs to be 50 years old and closely sort of resemble. Um, and I would argue there's quite a, at least on the square in Comanche, really probably all over Comanche, there are historical buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Can it be a house? Can it be a school? Can it be a place of business? Can it be a bank? Is there anything there that matters?
Right. Well, what you're talking about then is what makes a building significant. Courthouses generally are significant because they're the center of your community. They're where, they're the heartbeat. They're where you go to get your marriage license, birth certificate, to make the whole community function. It happens there. So the significance of a courthouse is kind of obvious. For other buildings, there can be a lot of reasons why you think a building would be significant. It could be really beautiful architecturally, like a design that stands out above others. It can be associated with a really important person. Like you can have a building that's not all that nice, but if Abraham Lincoln was built there, it's important for association with that person. It also could be that an event happened. Ford's Theater is where Lincoln was assassinated. It's important for that reason. It's significant. So there could be a whole variety of different reasons why a building could be significant. And that's the first step in the work that I do, really, is going in and looking at each building and trying to decide how significant it is. What is the area of significance that we can attach to that, explain to people why it's important. But when you're looking at a town like downtown Comanche, it's made up of a collection of buildings. So it could be that any one of those buildings individually is not all that important by itself, but it's part of a bigger animal. It's part of a larger history where all of the parts together are important. So in that case, we can do what's called a historic district, which sort of tries to look at the history of the entire area, how it came together, how buildings were built, what order they were built in, and why they're important as they relate to one another. So there's buildings in downtown Comanche that are really cool architectural landmarks. There's some associated with important local people that you could probably have listed on a historic registry like the National Register by themselves because they're important. But there's others that might not be that. They might not be that special building, but because they're part of the larger history of Comanche, they are important to a district, so they could be on a register for that reason with other buildings.
Yeah. Does that okay, so let's say once the historic, let's assume Comanche could or does get a historic district in place.
Mm-hmm.
What value is that to anybody?
Right. Good question. Well, and just to back up a little bit, as you know, I've been brought in to help establish a district, as you've just said, in Comanche. And that is in part because Cole, who brought me in to do that, he's interested in history. He also has buildings that are probably eligible for that. But also, by establishing a district, he's helping the entire community and the entire economic base, which is the heart of your question.
Yeah.
First, I want to put something out there that's very important. Okay, the National Register is a national registry held at the Library of Congress of historic buildings in America. So people like me document buildings or districts or whatever, and those get listed on the register. So it is a government listing, but it does not carry with it any kinds of regulations on an individual building owner. So a lot of people are worried if you have a district or you're on the register that the government's going to tell you what color you can paint it, or tell you can or can't do things with it, which is really not how the registry works. It's just a listing of important places in America. Doesn't have to be something that's important nationally, but things are important to Comanche, the Comanche citizens, and local history, and that counts as a nationally registered historic building or site. So I've been brought in to help establish a district within the downtown area, and that gives you a variety of benefits. One is there are weirdos like me who love historic places and who seek out historic districts. And if you go to McKinney or Cleburne or Fredericksburg, those are historic districts people go to because they have that history to them, and people love that sort of an environment. So there are economic benefits to tourism and travel and your local economy. But more specifically to what we're trying to accomplish here is if your building is on the National Register, it makes it eligible for what we call historic rehabilitation tax credits. There's a state program and there's a federal program for that. So the way that works is if your building is eligible or listed on the register, you can develop plans, drawings for the building to rehabilitate it, which means you're going to keep all the stuff that makes it cool, right? Historical stuff. And they're going to let you make enough changes, just enough changes to bring it back up to a functional modern building. So it meets code, it's accessible, might have fire sprinklers in it, whatever it needs to make it function in today's world. So you submit that application, and if you follow the rules, you keep what's cool, and you put your new stuff in, you can get up to 45% of your money back through tax credits. It's not tax deductions, it's actual credits. So, for example, in the federal program, you can get 20% of the money you spend back through income tax credits. Meaning if you owe $10,000 in income taxes, you can not pay some of that in order to get some of that money back.
Yep.
Now, if you're talking about, like the if you're talking about some buildings in the city, you've got buildings that are or projects that are tens of millions of dollars. So getting 20% of that money back means a lot. So you've seen that happen in big cities where, like in Dallas, there's no buildings left that haven't been rehabilitated under that program. The state has a program that's pretty much the same. They parallel, and it'll give you 25% back. So you combine those together, you're getting 45% of your money back. And then that's to pay for most things, like hiring me, hiring an architect, doing the drawings, the structural engineers, the mechanical engineers, plus all the construction costs for the most part. It doesn't pay for furniture, computers, some of your site work and landscaping. Like we like to say, if you can turn the building upside down and shake it, if it falls out, you can't take credits on it. But if it's part of the building,
Right.
you can take credits on it.
Yeah.
The state credit you get back through franchise tax credits. So it's a substantial amount of money of your investment that you can get back. Now, a lot of people say, well, we don't pay franchise taxes, or our tax burden is not enough to make that worth doing. Well, both programs have mechanisms where you can sell those credits to somebody else who does pay a lot in taxes. So they can buy them from you, pay you, for example, 90 cents on the dollar, and you take that cash, you keep it, you put it in the building, do whatever you want to do with it, and then they get the benefit of taking the rest of the credit from their taxes. So there's big companies like Sherwin-Williams Paint who buy up credits, take advantage of that. So it helps people who need the initial investment. It helps people who, for example, don't pay franchise taxes to be able to capture that credit. So that's what we're doing. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I'm being real quiet because this is all just brilliant information, understanding for anybody listening, for me personally. It's like, wow, that's cool stuff. Why doesn't everybody just do it, right? I mean, it seems like to me, wow, that sounds like free money. There's no such thing. So why do not more people do it?
Well, I guess part of it is the strings. Okay, so I'll give you an example. And again, it's easy to get into the weeds and people glaze over once you start getting into the details of these programs. That's why they hire me to do it for them. But for the federal program, to get that 20% credit, you have to do what they call a substantial rehabilitation. So what that's defined as is you have to spend as much as your building is worth. The building, not the land, just the building. So if you have a building that's valued at $500,000, you have to spend $500,000 to get your credit. Now, some people are lucky they buy a building for $10. All they got to do is spend $10. But if you have a building that's worth $1 million, you got to spend $1 million. The benefit of the state program is that you just have to spend $5,000. Doesn't matter. As long as you spend $5,000, you can get the credit. So a lot of people choose or are only able to do the state program, but many will do both. It generally makes sense to do both at the same time because all the rules are the same for both. And if you're going to spend enough money, it's best to try to do both. But that nut is a little harder to crack on that federal program than it is the state program. And I would say another important reason is, again, especially in smaller communities, people's skepticism of the government. They really think that the government's going to get in their business. Now, I'll say for the federal program, both programs, they do review what you're going to do, and they ask you to do it a certain way. And so most of the time, that means that your project is probably going to cost a little more initially than it would have otherwise, because they don't let you do crappy work. They try not to let you do bad work. They want you to do things the right way because they're investing in it and they want it done right. So that is way offset by the benefit you get from the credit, though. The added expense
Yeah.
is way offset. But then an example is
Yep.
if you have an old building with really nice old wood windows, and it's going to be cheaper to rip them out and put in aluminum windows, you probably can't do that. You probably have to keep
Yeah.
wood windows in it, right? And that's
Yep. Take the wood windows out, refurbish them, rebuild them, put them back in.
right. Or in some cases, we can retrofit them and put insulated glass panels in them, things like that, to make them function like a modern window thermally, but they still are the
Yeah.
original window. So, and that can cost more money. And people don't like that.
Yeah.
It's hard to see that initial upfront cost and extrapolate the fact that it's worth it, because in the end you're getting so much money more back. Plus, it's allowing you to do something better. Like for me, that's what I would prefer to do. But if I was just stuck with an old building with those windows and I didn't have an incentive, I couldn't do it. And if I did do it, I'd have to do it the cheapest way, perhaps. So it really gives you that opportunity. Um, and the program can be a challenge for smaller communities and people with smaller buildings. It's one thing for a deep-pocketed developer in downtown Dallas to make a multi-million-dollar project go. It can be really hard for a local citizen in Comanche to make a $500,000 project go. So there can be real financial challenges. And the upfront cost of doing things like having me come in and do the historical listing to make the building, eligible for the program, because you have to be on a listing to participate. Like in Comanche, the person I'm doing the district for is taking that bullet for everybody else. I mean, Cole is funding this district for the benefit of the entire community. So
I was going to ask that. High five, Cole. At least from a guy. I mean, here's the other thing: you never make everybody happy with anything you do, no matter what. It's impossible. So, to me, that's a high five, Cole. Maybe the next guy or gal may not think so, but I was thinking, does the city government have to be involved with that? Do they have to approve it? Pretty much, he can go do it. It's not going to harm anybody. There's no government reaching into anybody that may own property in this district.
Correct.
Outside of now, you might have an easier path to get Jay to come list your building, and if you were interested in making some improvements, get some of these tax credits.
Right. So, well, now we're going back a little bit. Now, you got to keep in mind we're talking about two different things. The historic district and the listing is something that is valuable to Comanche no matter what. I mean, having a district established, like I said, it's good for publicity, it's good for commerce, it's good for tourism. It's a good thing. And there are no real drawbacks. There's no regulations attached. But it is not exactly true that anybody could just come in and say, well, I'm going to make Comanche a historic district and just do it on their own. It is a government process. It's open. And as an example, we've prepared the draft of the nomination, and the Texas Historical Commission will come to Comanche in the next few months. They'll put a public notice in the paper to announce this. They're going to have a meeting, and everybody can come and ask questions, vent frustrations, demand of the government not be involved in their business, whatever they want to do. And it is possible, if the community banded together and said, I don't want this district, that the government would say, well, okay, I mean, we need people to agree that you want it. So, I mean, I don't know. I would assume, generally they want to get at least the majority of people in favor. It is possible, if somebody doesn't want to be considered part of the district, that they could demand their building not be included. Sometimes there's ways to carve it out. Why? I have no idea. It makes no sense to me.
Right.
But that has happened. So there is a voice, and people can express their opinion. And it's not really the case that anybody could set up a district, or like I couldn't come and if you had an individual building, I couldn't have it listed on the register without your approval. You'd have to approve of that. So there's a
Awesome.
public process. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Is the district you're currently writing the nomination for the square? Like, what is it?
Mm-hmm.
What space does it cover?
When you're doing a district, one of the rules is that at least half of the buildings that were historically part of the area have to still be there. So, like, I go to communities like if you go to Highland Park or University Park in Dallas, they have beautiful historic homes there, but so many have been torn down. They couldn't do a district anymore because there's not half left anymore. They've been torn down. So um, then you're going to try to look for a place that has a shared, understandable history. Like uh, downtown Comanche is a commercial district, and it's got more than half of its buildings of historic age older than 50 years left. So it makes sense to write a history that explains how that happened. How did the district come to be what it is, and what do the buildings mean? Now, if there's a residential district of houses next to that, it might not quite fit, right? Because it's not commercial, it's residential. So you might do a separate district for that that explains how that residential district was platted, who the developer was, who designed the houses, what makes them important. So that could be a separate district. It's not impossible that you do a larger district that included a lot of different kinds of things, but usually it's going to be similar resources that are grouped together that have a shared history.
Yeah, sweet. So downtown Comanche, I'm just trying to picture it. I mean, I've lived here my whole life. To me, that means the courthouse and all the buildings that make a square around it. That is
Pretty,
downtown Comanche to me.
pretty much. You know, in a lot of communities, uh, well, obviously, that might spread out bigger. Of course, in a
Yeah,
city, it's many, many blocks outside what the original square might be. Comanche has remained relatively compact. Um, I
yeah,
just recently did a district for Big Spring. It's doing the same thing. They have building owners there. They want to capitalize on the credits. They want to establish a district. So we did that. It's way bigger. And they have their different areas. Like they have an area that was built along the railroad tracks where the community started. And then they have a historic square a few blocks away that kind of pushed development that direction. And then the Bankhead Highway came in and cars came in, and cars always change everything. I mean, people came in by wagon and by train forever. Suddenly there's all these cars, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cars, and it makes the development patterns change. So in Big Spring, it's this weird shaped district that stretches all different directions with that shared history. Comanche's a little different. Um, you've got the square, and you do have the depot that came in later, but the depot didn't really pull things that direction too much. Everything stayed around the square, and then even with the highway, things didn't change that much. It all stayed pretty much in that 1 to 2 block area right around the square. So that is what we're
yeah.
looking at there in Comanche. And it does stretch a little bit, like it stretches a little bit to the west because we're taking in the old jail, which is a block or so off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it stretches a little bit to the north because we want to take in the library, which is an important building.
Yes,
People
sir.
don't think
Yes, sir.
people don't tend to think, well, that was built in the 70s. Well, 70s or 50 years ago,
Yeah, right.
right?
Right.
Believe it or not. Um, and so it's pulled a few different directions, but really it's mostly just that compact area right around the square. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I'm just curious about these tax credits again. Do you have to have a historic district first, then you get your building, I don't know, qualified, then you could do your renovations, or is it, explain that a little bit for me and us.
Okay. Well, the process varies from project to project. A lot of times a building isn't listed yet. And so you do an initial application to ask them, if I want to get it listed, would it be eligible for listing? And then if so, can I do this tax credits? And they'll tell you yes. In some cases, it's already on the register, slam dunk. You're already done. You don't even have to worry about that.
Oh, real quick pause because that makes me remember. I mean, we need to come back, and we've probably already skipped some the pieces of this. Like, listen, everybody, we can't fit it all in even this one conversation. This
True.
is it's already mushroomed into this huge idea or huge reality around uh, rebuilding and doing some cool stuff. What if you own a building and you didn't even think about it or know about it, and you don't know it's listed or it's already accessed to these funds a couple of years ago? Now it's in new hands. Is there any protection from that or that somebody should consider?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but
Okay, let me ask the question a little more
okay.
pointedly or make it a more clear question. There's let's say there's a building on the square, it looks cool. I want to buy it. The guy that owns it wants to sell it, and I go buy it. And now I learn about this, and I'm like, "Oh, cool, I want to do that. There's some renovations and sounds like a great idea." Am I going to show up, or are you going to come do the research and find out, "Oh, wait, that guy before you did this already,
Oh yeah, I see what
and
you're
you
saying.
can't do it"?
Um, if Well, first off, for the federal program, there is 5 years after you finish where you're not supposed to sell the building to anybody else, and you're also not supposed to mess it up. So, like, if they pay to make the front of the building look all beautiful, give you credits for that, and then you come in and wreck it, they're going to want their money back. If you sell the
Yeah,
building, they're going to want their money back. But that doesn't apply to the state program for whatever reason. They didn't put those stipulations on there, so you could do whatever. Um, but the minute you buy it, if you buy a building um, as a new owner, you don't pay the price for, like, if the guy sold it before 5 years. That's not your problem. You could, if you spend what you pay for the building in improvements, you can get credits on it. So usually as a buyer, you don't have to worry about it. You have clean hands. Another thing that's related to that is if I buy a building on the square and it's really cool, and then I mess it up really bad, and then I decide, hey, wait, but I hear I can get these let's go in this program and get these tax credits, and I submit drawings to them for what I want to do, and they see that I've messed it up, they can tell me, no, you blew it already. You can't get credits because you're
yeah.
building up.
Or the guy before you blew it. He messed it up too much
Well, it's
to
possible.
get back to the.
Well, it's true. Like the guy before you could mess it up so much that it's no longer eligible to be listed anymore because it doesn't look like it did before. But
Yeah.
usually, if an owner before you does little things that are bad, but don't result in it being not eligible anymore, it doesn't matter. That you have clean hands. You don't have to worry about that. So,
All right.
uh,
Sweet.
right. Anyway, we got to circle back to what we were talking about before.
I know. That's my fault. I should have took a note. I don't even remember where we were going, but I had thought of this question earlier, and
Oh,
I said, "Man, I sure want to get to that."
I think it had to do with how you get your building determined eligible through
Yes.
the program. Okay, so in some cases, like I said, your building might not be listed yet, but you can turn in some paperwork, and they'll tell you whether it could be. And if it could be, they'll tell you to go ahead. You can do tax credits, and you just have to get it on that register by the time you're finished doing all of your work. Otherwise, they're not going to give you the credit. You have to promise that you're going to get the building put on the national register, or where applicable, the state register, to get those credits. Um, if the building's already listed, your only job is to prove to them that somebody hasn't messed it up so much that it shouldn't be listed anymore, right? And if you're in a district and you're listed as a building that's contributing to the district, again, it's the same thing. You automatically qualify to participate as long as it hadn't been messed up. But an important thing to remember is your building has to be eligible to the register before you start. What that means is, let's say your building's been messed up, but the old building's in there somewhere, right? And you turn in drawings and say, I'm going to restore it and make it look just like it was in 1885. You can't really do that because it has to be eligible before you start. So, and I don't want to pick on any of the buildings in Comanche, but I'm going to pick on some of them. There are some buildings in Comanche that are very old that aren't considered eligible as part of the district right now. They don't get to participate because maybe they got somebody put old barnwood on the front of it to make it look like something else, and that's covering up the old building. You can't see it anymore. So if they want to be able to be determined eligible, they need to take that off. Let us see what the building looks like, figure out if it can be added to the district or not, and then they could probably do the credits. But there are some buildings in downtown that have metal panels or wood or something else that's covering up historic materials, because that stuff that they've covered
so
up,
they aren't going in the district, or that area is not going into the district at this point, or is it in the district?
What
it
happens
just wouldn't be eligible. Go ahead.
So what we've drawn a map of the district that has every building shown, and it's coded to show which ones are considered historic and which ones aren't. So there's not that many really in downtown Comanche that have those kinds of strikes against them, but there are some. There are some that are too new,
sure.
And there are some that have materials on the front. Now, it's possible for an old building to have had somebody change it in the past, and the changes are now so old they're historic. So like say you had an 1885 building and somebody in 1920 put a real cool new 1920s front on it, that could be eligible. But if you've got barnwood from 1980 on the front of it, it's probably not going to work.
Gotcha. Well, I think about the bank where Simmons Bank is. I mean, that's, to me, an old historic building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do those bankers ever think about that kind of thing? Like, hey, we could, I don't know that they'd be even interested in changing that building up much, though. It's already been pretty well fixed up.
What's cool, what's kind of nice about the credits, the credit process, is they don't really make you put things back like they were. Like if the building's been changed, but it's still enough there to be considered historic, they don't make you go back and change every bad thing that somebody else did and put it back like it was in 1890. Their main goal is that when you do the work you're going to do, that you don't do any more damage, right? So that's their goal. So it's possible for a building owner who's already, like a building's had a lot of changes done to it, to still do the credits and fix their building up and get new infrastructure in it, but not have to do every tiny detail that can be very expensive. I mean, the preference is for like the old First National Bank had a turret on the corner that's now gone, and there's sort of a big metal panel on the side. They probably wouldn't be required to put that back. But it would be real nice if they did, and the credits provide them an opportunity to get half of it paid for. So it really would be a good thing to do. And what's interesting about the banks in Comanche is you've got 3 old bank buildings, right? You got Comanche National Bank, you got First National Bank, and you got the State National Bank, which is where the City Hall was for a while on the south side of the square. Those are all cool old bank buildings. In the 1960s, every one of them built a new bank. So you have the 3 1960s vintage banks on the square. The reason they did that is because people wanted to drive their car into town and drive through the bank drive-through. So every bank had to build a new bank with a drive-through in order to compete with each other. So they left their old buildings, built the new ones. And so you have those 60s buildings, which I bet a lot of people don't like very much, but they're contributing buildings because they're older
Yeah.
than 50 years old. And whether we're fond of the style from the 1960s right now, um, they're still an important part of the development of Comanche. And in 50 years, they might be considered the coolest buildings in town, even though we
That's
don't
right.
like
I
them for.
mean, the mullets come back.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, the mullet hairstyle and the bell-bottom jeans. It's funny how those styles kind of do seem to make a little rotation.
Right. So you have the newest building in the district is the library, 1974, and then those bank buildings from the 60s, and then most everything else is 1940s and before.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a minimum? Let's say some. I'm just curious. I wonder if somebody listening probably would say the same thing too. And you've touched on it, but I'd like to just make it clear. Is there something too small to apply or to bother with doing this for?
It's depends on the individual project. It really does. Like if you've got a tiny little burger hut on a corner somewhere and you want to spend, and it's worth $10,000, and you want to spend $10,000 on it, and you want to take whatever kind of income tax credit you can get on that, yeah, I mean, it could make sense. Um,
The government's not going to decline it if it's not of a big enough dollar figure.
no, I mean, as I said, the state program requires you spend at least 5,000, and the federal requires you spend what the value of the building is. And like I say, some people I've known have bought buildings for $1, and they only have to spend $1. Uh,
Yeah.
um,
Who determines what the building's worth?
well, there are various mechanisms. Of course, the first one is what I just said. Like if you buy a building, you can justify the fact that what you just paid for it is what it's worth, right? So even if it's
Right.
$1, that would qualify. In other cases, let's say I've had a building for a very long time, you might use the tax appraisal district's valuation for the building. And like I say, it's just the building and not the land. So you discount the land off of that, and depreciation. When we start getting into the tax aspects of it and the legal aspects of it, I start to glaze over a little bit because
Yeah.
there are people that are trained in just that part of it. So that can be another hurdle to some people. Um, I don't think the processes are that difficult, but um, if you need to hire people like me, that can really kind of mess it up because, the more people you have to pay, the more difficult it is to make your project work. So if you're spending $10,000 to fix up your building and you have to spend $5,000 just on eggheads to get all the applications done and make sure you file your taxes properly, may not be worth it to you. It just depends.
Yeah. Holy moly, that is so interesting. I mean, it really is, and I'm not that big of a history buff. I am doing a series here around the history of Comanche, and it is inspiring me to be more historical about my community. So,
Mm-hmm.
really, high five to Cole for kind of, at least on a personal level, for me, getting me kind of in this space and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the community that way. And
Yeah.
glad you've been around working on it. Glad you've lent your time to have this conversation with me. I don't even know what else to ask. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking, man, that's all
Mm-hmm.
interesting stuff. I think it should spur anybody listening who has interest in those things or even property within this district to start thinking about, okay, cool, man, how could I leverage this? Is the money going to go away? That's another thing I'm curious about with when you talk about the government. What's the chances of them deciding to cancel these tax credits?
I think it's very unlikely, and I would say the biggest reason for that is that uh, the credits benefit really important, powerful people with lots of money. So, uh, you know, the big developers who are taking advantage of these programs in the big cities, they want them and they need them, and they don't want them to go away. So I don't think that's going to happen. Uh, there might be tweaks to them. They might change things a little bit, but I think, really what I'm seeing is that they're trying to figure out ways to help smaller communities take advantage. For example, there's been talk about making the credit worth, the state credit worth 30%, or the federal credit worth 30% for local communities, um, to help sweeten the pot and make it possible for somebody who has an old building and they don't have a fortune to spend on it to make it work a little bit better. So, and another important part of this is your courthouse. The state is moving forward with plans and specs, and so probably late this year after the legislative session, there'll be another grant application round where the county is going to apply for the money to do the actual construction. And with the legislature meeting every 2 years and then funding the program, gets reallocated every 2 years, that always makes me nervous. You'd think in a year where we have so much extra money, and because counties are state entities, that they put substantial funds in the program to restore courthouses, you never know. So I encourage members of the community to call your state reps, tell them how important that program is to you, and how much you need the money. Because if they fund it substantially this session, you'll probably get your courthouse restored in the next 3 years. And that's the centerpiece.
What was that? 3 years, you say?
Right, because the grant applications they'll go out this fall probably, and they'll award grants probably spring of 2024. Then they'll start construction. It'll probably take them 18 months to 2 years to finish.
Yeah.
So yeah, in about 3 years, you could have a brand new, sparkly, restored courthouse on your square, which is the center of the whole thing. I mean,
yeah, totally. That's right. And I think for Comanche in particular, I don't even know if I like this word, but the urban sprawl from DFW is getting closer all the time. So we're becoming a more likely destination for somebody to come experience something. Our little town used to be a long way from the city. Mm-hmm. Well, now the city's getting closer all the time. So
yeah, I mean,
all of those things just
absolutely. Remote work's allowed me to move. I live in Palestine. I work in Dallas. I live in Palestine, and I'm in Dallas part of the time, and I'm here part of the time. So it's more and more people are going to be escaping the city and moving to rural communities because they can. And I don't want to sit in the city and sit in traffic. I'd rather be out here. So I think you're spot on with that. And counties that have redone their courthouses, they're seeing economic activity increasing on the square. And also just having that government building in the middle of your town brings people to town every day that are going to do business in the businesses around the square. So, having that building redone and having activity there is really important to making everything work.
Jay, wealth of knowledge, sir. Thank you so much for coming onto the Cowboy Perspective to give us this little history lesson. And to me, it's even a future lesson. It's part of extending the history to the future.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the history part, right?
Yeah, we never even. That's right. Well, I mean, I guess we got another 5 minutes. In your research so far, have you got just a story that you're like, man, that was really cool. I wasn't expecting to find that. Or, wow, this is what I kind of find this in every little town I've been working on around the courthouse.
The thing about your town, the first thing that struck me is I've never seen a town that has burned down and blown up more than your town in my life. I mean, the town, was established before the Civil War, and when the war came, the Army left, and there was no protection for the local community anymore, and the town pretty much died. It wasn't until after the war that people came back. And then after things got built up around the square, especially on the west side, in the 1890s, things just started burning. Like pretty much the entire west side of the square was destroyed. Most of the east side of the square was destroyed, some of the north side. So even though the community of Comanche was established in the 1850s, you don't have any buildings really that are older than the 1880s, except for, of course, Cora, the old courthouse that was moved from someplace else. Um, so I mean, every year it was just something else burned down or blew up, and they had to rebuild. So,
Why do you add blew up? Tell me what actually blew up.
well, there was a building on the west side where apparently, if I remember the story correctly, somebody was storing gasoline and dynamite, and the thing blew up. And it
Oh my goodness.
blew up some of the buildings on either side. It blew all the windows out of the courthouse, um, and did a whole lot of damage. I don't think anybody was killed, but yeah, it blew up. I'm not kidding.
Wow. Yeah, dynamite. I feel like a little spark and kapow.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the Comanche Chief where it is now, that's its third home. Uh, it was burnt out at least twice from various
Oh yeah.
fires.
So, yep. Now you talked about these banks, and this point, if you need to go, you just let me go. But I want to
No,
or I'm curious. Okay, so Comanche National. My mom tells me stories of her being a teller at the Comanche National that is now Starbows.
hmm
Is that the Comanche National you're talking about?
hmm I think so. On the corner.
Okay.
hmm
Yep, on the corner. So First Comanche, what building is that exactly? Is that the one on the southwest corner?
Oh, okay. So Comanche National is on the southwest, and
Right. Now, when I think about the square, though, I also add that building that is kind of catty corner from the southwest corner. In your mind, does that see? I make a full square, and I don't leave that one little. I guess it'd be like if you got the crossroads there. So every corner of the
hmm
crossroads is part of the
hmm
square, in my
hmm
estimation.
right. Well, Comanche National Bank is on the south side of the square, all the way to the west on that south block,
Yes.
catty corner,
Yes.
right? Then on the north side of the square, on that north block, all the way to the east, is the First National Bank building, which was built as a bank. It's actually got two parts that look the same. It had a bank on the corner, and then it had what was called the Scurry Grocery Store in the two-story section next to that, just to the west. Um, and so, the 60s building across the street from that to the east is that 60s building they built to replace the bank.
Okay.
And
Sure.
then
Yes,
the
sir.
Comanche
Now I'm catching
on
up.
the south, the building that's catty corner that's across the street from it, that's 60s, that's the bank they built to replace their bank. And then right in the middle of the south side is that what was the city hall for a while. That was State National Bank, and they built the 60s bank building that's across from what was Dudley Brothers, right,
Okay.
Simmons Bank,
Okay.
which is a fantastic building too. That 1920s Dudley's brother building is
Oh yeah, my dad will tell stories of his dad telling him pouring the concrete wheelbarrow at a time for that. Some of those are the kind of stories that you can find in those buildings when you start going individually.
awesome.
Uh, Now, but that banking structure you just talked about now makes so much sense, and those names have changed. Like
Mhm.
I would say, Comanche National built the one across kind of catty corner, but then that turned to First Comanche at
Mhm.
one time when Comanche National went
Mhm.
over
Yeah.
to the Dudley Brother building.
Mhm.
So, and now
Yeah,
it's Texas
all
Bank,
the
and the
names
other
have
one's
changed. Yeah, and
yeah,
what's tough about my job is I'm not from Comanche, uh, and so when I'm doing all these histories and I'm talking about these buildings, I know less than almost everybody else in town. So,
yeah,
uh, you know, I sometimes will get it wrong, or maybe, or sometimes I get it right, and the community's got it wrong because the history's been changed over time, sort of like the grapevine game, and you know,
yes, sir.
people's recollections change. So it's always an interesting exercise to go throughout that. Plus, as you say, names change and things change. But like Margaret Dudley up at the library, who's part of the Dudley family, you know, it took me a long time in my feeble mind to make the connection that she's a Dudley and that she can answer questions about the Dudley family.
Yeah, sure.
So, it's always makes you a little nervous when you're working in a community. You're going to get it wrong because, you always know more than I do about your community.
Well, right. I mean, and you only have access to what you have access to. And I thought you said something really poignant as well, that the grapevine doesn't have any stewards. Nobody's making sure the grapevine tells the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So partially I was interested because I've heard these stories about that building and that building. Then I've been alive long enough, I've seen some of those changes. So
Mm-hmm.
it's all fun.
Yeah. Well, what's really cool now is you can go online, and pretty much every newspaper in the United States has been scanned in and can be searched word searches. And you can go in and you can read the Comanche Chief and other local newspapers, and they give you firsthand accounts of everything that happened, from the fires and explosions I'm talking about all the way up to the building of the library. You can read all about that. And that's really the best source for finding that stuff, is looking in the old papers.
Do you ever find that the blueprint from this old building is just gone, disappeared? There's no way to really know how it was built or who built it?
Most of the time.
Oh, that's the truth most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah. Yeah. It's really rare. You're lucky in that your courthouse was built by Wyatt Hedrick, who's a very important Texas architect, and his collection is at UT. O'Neill Ford Powell and Carson built your library. He's very important. And not only does the library have copies of his work, but also UT has copies of that. But that's probably the extent of buildings that have drawings I can look at in Comanche, unless an owner has them and I don't know it.
Sure. Well, sir, have a great day in Palestine. Thank you for joining and just talking to me and really educating me, and I hope everybody listening has enjoyed it as well. We'll see, I guess, when you come down for the public meeting and all those things, or maybe I'll bump into you when you're around town doing research. If you see me, now you know who I am. Holler at me.
Okay. And
if you're coming to town, let me know.
If anybody has questions, you can reach me through our website, architexas.com, architexas.com. You can find me, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's got questions or cool information that I might want to use.
You bet. We'll put links to all that in the show notes. So if you're listening to this podcast on any podcast platform, you just go to the description. There's links in there to Jay's business and any of this other information that we can make linkable. We like to do that. Just give you an easy opportunity to peruse this information.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate you.
Hold on a second, Jay.